Hello, my name's Bernard Frischer. I'm a professor of informatics at Indiana University. I will speak first and provide the overall context for the study that we're presenting today. In this talk, we report on a paper that we published earlier this year. As you'll see, the CityEngine played a critical role as a scientific tool for our investigation. Our focus in the paper concerned a type of monument found in the city center of ancient Rome called the rostra. The city center is better known as the Roman Forum. I imagine many of those attending this event have visited Rome and gone to the Roman Forum. Located at the foot of four of the city's famous 7 hills, it was a hub of the road system, with many key roads converging on this central plaza. You see its location indicated in yellow in this slide. In earliest times, so in the Archaic period running roughly from 700 to 500 BCE, this was a multi-purpose space used for markets, religious cults, government, and popular festivals. Over time, as the city prospered and its empire spread across the Mediterranean littoral and to points north, the Forum lost most of its practical functions like those markets. And as you see in this slide, during the High Imperial period, so 100, 200 of our era, it became a stately place for marble-clad temples, historic monuments, and government buildings like the Senate House and the law courts. The rostra was the place where leaders at the political assemblies held in the Roman Forum stood to speak to their fellow citizens assembled below. After centuries of use, Julius Caesar demolished the first archaic rostra, which had existed for several hundred years before his day, and Julius Caesar had it rebuilt, where you see it in this slide. The advantage of the new location is that it now faced the Forum's large open plaza, which afforded room for many more citizens to assemble than had earlier been the case. Within a couple of decades of this change, however, the rostra no longer served the purpose for which it was originally intended. Under Caesar's heir and son by adoption, Augustus, the republican form of government, with its assemblies of the people harangued by speakers from the rostra, ceased to exist. Instead, Rome was ruled by a general, imperator in Latin, and his top aides and allies. The assemblies of the people stopped meeting to debate and pass laws. Power was instead concentrated into the hands of the imperator, or to use the English derivative, emperor. Yet a strange thing happened. Not only was Caesar's rostra not demolished, and the space reused for something else more relevant to the new state of affairs, but as compared to Caesar's simple elevated platform, it was gradually enlarged and enhanced with numerous honorary columns and statues. And stranger to tell, centuries later, as you can see in this slide, a second rostra was built at the other end of the Forum Plaza, in front of the Temple of the Divine Julius Caesar, and we call this later rostra the Diocletianic, or sometimes the late antique rostra. It is dated to around 280 to 300 of our era. Our study addressed the issue of why this happened, that is, why was the Caesarian rostra preserved, and why was a new rostra constructed at the opposite end of the Forum Plaza? As you will see in researching these matters, the CityEngine plugin to ArcGIS played a central role as the tool that allowed us to visualize various three-dimensional viewsheds in and around the forum, and also to measure with great precision the angle of tilt of the heads of people, such as tourists visiting the ancient city, in order to gawk at the monuments. And of all the must-see tourist sites in the ancient city, we know that first on the list was the Roman Forum. We know this from a precious passage in the late antique historian Ammianus Marcellinus. He wrote about one very famous tourist's first visit to the Eternal City, the Emperor Constantius II. The son of Constantine the Great, Constantius II ruled from 337 to 361 of our era. Constantine the Great had moved the capital of the empire from Rome to Byzantium, an old Greek city controlling the sensitive strait called the Bosphorus between Europe and Asia, between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Byzantium was renamed Constantinople in honor of the emperor. Given this epochal change in Rome's status, it is not surprising that Constantine's son Constantius II was born and raised in the new capital and did not even visit Rome until he was 40 years old in the year 357. Ammianus gives a long description of his trip, which begins as follows, and you can see the quotation in this slide. So then the emperor entered Rome and went straight to the Roman Forum, and when he had come to the rostra, the most renowned symbol of ancient power, he was awestruck, and on every side on which his eyes rested, he was dazzled by the crowding together of marvelous sights. Afterwards he spoke to the nobility in the Senate House, and to the people from the tribunal. So, we learn from this precious passage that the first thing Constantius did upon touring Rome was to go to the Roman Forum, and the first thing he did in the Forum was to mount the rostra, which, by the way, we think was the original Caesarean rostra, to take in the awesome monuments packed in and around the city's ancient central square. This slide shows you the view he will have had looking toward the east. Note that Ammianus does tell us that Constantius gave some speeches, but he did not do so while standing on the rostra, but went inside the Senate House to talk to the senators, and on the Forum Plaza, he went to a spot called the Tribunal to talk to the common people. So from this passage we get positive proof that the rostra had ceased playing its old role as the place to stand on when you gave a political speech, and instead it had a new function as a viewing platform for tourists like Constantius II. Why did this happen? This is where the CityEngine came in. Our working hypothesis was based on our experience in giving virtual tours of our 3D reconstruction model of the Roman Forum. Doing this made us acutely aware of something unexpected. Whereas Roman architects picked up from Hellenistic Greek architects the practice of organizing civic spaces on the principles of symmetry, axiality, and frontality, the civic space of the Roman Forum had become so crowded with those awesome monuments of all kinds that there was absolutely no possibility of providing axial and frontal views of many of the most important sites. Let me give you a quick example. One of the most important shrines of the state religion located on the Forum Plaza was the Temple of Concordia. Concordia, or harmony, was a goddess celebrating the peace and cooperation that ideally existed between the different social classes of Rome, and also between members of the imperial family, and between that family and the senators. The building indicated by the red arrow in the slide went through several phases, of which the last occurred under Tiberius, the second emperor and son by adoption of Augustus. This is what you have been looking at in this slide. In this final building phase, the structure has aptly been called a temple museum, in that its facade and interior were adorned with many colossal statues, as seen in this slide. Now, for centuries, when you visited the Forum, you could get the expected frontal and axial view of the temple facade, as we see in the slide we've been looking at. It shows the view from the time of Tiberius, so the 20s of our era, down to about 200 of our era. However, in roughly that year, 200, if you stood at the same spot, this is what you saw. Not the facade of the venerable temple, but the west side of a new triumphal arch of the emperor of the day, whose name was Septimius Severus. The red arrow points to the arch in question. So if you wanted to see all the sculpture decorating the facade of the temple, what did you have to do now? Your only recourse, as you can see in this slide, was to mount the Caesarean rostra and gaze at it from there, as you can see in this slide. Of course, to make this work, you had to accept looking at the temple from an oblique angle, and not from the traditional frontal and axial point of view. Our project was to take a casual anecdotal observation of the kind I have just presented and make it more rigorous and systematic. That entailed studying all possible points of view of looking at the various monuments, identifying the ideal point of view defined as the one coming closest to the monument with the least deviation from the ideal frontal and axial view, and requiring the smallest tilt of the head needed to take in the scene. So at this point, I will turn the podium over, or I should say the rostra, over to my co-author, Dave Massey, who will tell you how we use the CityEngine to achieve these goals.
Thank you, Dr. Frischer. Hello, everyone. My name is Dave Massey, and I'm currently a PhD candidate in the Department of Geography at Indiana University. I've worked on archaeological projects throughout the Mediterranean, including in Cyprus, Greece, and Sicily. I'm currently finishing up my dissertation, which uses drone-based LiDAR to examine the construction of Native American mounds. Today, I will be discussing the methodology and our findings from our investigation using CityEngine. CityEngine is a powerful 3D modeling environment, and what we were most interested in this study was its capacity for performing visibility analyses. To reiterate what Dr. Frischer said earlier, CityEngine allows us to analyze the visual experience of visiting the Roman Forum from a particular moment in history in 3 dimensions. In virtually recreating an urban landscape that no longer exists today, we could begin to address the question of which rostra did the emperor use. Moreover, looking at Ammianus' quote again, we believed CityEngine could offer us an opportunity to determine which sites were so dazzling and marvelous based on the rostra he ascended. Within the field of archaeology, visibility analyses are important because, short of resurrecting and interviewing an ancient person, they offer a way to gain insight in how past peoples and societies interacted with and ascribed meaning to architectural constructions or monuments. Early GIS visibility analyses, or viewsheds, were two-dimensional, outputting a simple binary of yes, you can see this object, or not, from this point. However, looking at these example images, to quote Connolly Lake, it is obvious that the 2.5D viewshed bears little resemblance to what people experience on the ground. Labeling areas on a landscape as yes, you can see, or no, you cannot see, fails to capture information about the size, shape, back versus front size, variable angles, and so on that would be necessary to answer a seemingly simple question as, what can you see from there? More to the point, since people in the past engaged with 3-dimensional architectural environments, certain social meanings encoded in built settings will remain undetected when space is being studied in 2 dimensions. A key barrier has been that even though digital 3D models have been built for archaeological purposes, prior to the widespread availability of Google SketchUp, 3D Studio Max, and Blender, just to name a few, They were very difficult to create because they required highly specialized knowledge. Options were also limited by interfaces that could support 3D visual analyses. For our study, CityEngine addresses 3 issues that have typically inhibited 3D visual analyses in archaeology. Finding an interface that can import 3D models created in other software in different file formats, the ability to georeference 3D models to the real-world coordinates, and the ability to easily perform visibility analysis on the model. Moving on to the methodology, the 3D models of the Roman Forum we used for the study came from the Rome Reborn project. Launched in 1996, this project has developed 4 iterations of ancient Rome in 320 CE, a time shortly before the capital of the empire was moved to Constantinople. This year was chosen because it represents the peak of urban development of the ancient city, and after the capital had moved, new civic building was generally forbidden in the Eternal City. We used 4 models of the Forum from different time periods listed here in reverse chronological order. To generate the 4 models, Rome Reborn progressively removed major additions to create approximations of how the Forum looked in earlier periods. The models of the Roman Forum were built in 3D Studio Max. To bring them into CityEngine, they are exported as object and texture files. The models were then imported into CityEngine as static models. Using satellite imagery from Planet Labs, the models were then georeferenced by carefully moving, scaling, and rotating until the footprints of the model aligned with the satellite imagery. Once aligned, viewsheds were created looking out from the Caesarian, or the West Rostra, and the Diocletianic Rostra, or East Rostra, towards the buildings and monuments in the Forum. To replicate the average adult male point of view in Roman times, we set the camera to a height of 1.6 meters from the ground. We then experimented with ergonomic tilts of the eyes through the viewshed in order to find the optimal viewing position, which we limited to between 0 and 30 degrees. As previously mentioned from Ammianus' account, we learned that Constantius II mounted the rostra not to give a political speech, but for the aesthetic experience of viewing the monuments within the Forum itself. But which rostra? Where specifically did he stand to see the monuments? And what did he find so impressive? Since we're interested in how one views a site as a tourist and admirer, we employed the idea of a best general view to determine the spot at which one could get the fullest and most direct view of a structure from the rostra. The way we define best general view is the minimum distance at which the monument is in full view and at which head tilt is within the comfort zone of 0 to 30 degrees upward or downward tilt. The concept of the best general view is used widely by photographers and art historians, and this comfort zone has, interestingly, been studied and set by the Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers, who have determined the best viewing angles in movie theaters. Now, canonical to Roman architectural design, the best general view meant one that is axial and frontal with respect to the feature of interest. This point is reinforced through buildings built during the Roman Republic in the imperial fora. So given these parameters, our search for the location that the emperor found himself impressed by the Forum's majestic architecture required precise 3D modeling and analysis. This is another reason why CityEngine was so crucial. Being able to use a point-of-view perspective enables us to pinpoint the locations at which one could get an unobstructed or nearly unobstructed and comfortable view of various monuments when standing atop the rostra. It also helped demonstrate that when it came to the late antique Forum, there were instances where it was not possible to view buildings from this perspective because of the way the Forum had been built up over time. Let's turn to the case studies and first examine the West Rostra. Here's a table of buildings visible from the West Rostra, their distance to their facade, along with the eye tilt and degrees required for the best general view. One of the clearest canonical best general views from atop the West Rostra is of the Curia Julia. As you can see from the figure, the axis of the Curia Julia directly intersects with the West Rostra. Hence, from the time it was built, the West Rostra offered the best general view of an important building to which it was tightly related to by date and patron, the Curia Julia. While the Temple of Concordia's best possible view was originally a frontal and axial view of the facade and its sculpture, it was obstructed by construction of the Arch of Septimius Severus in 203 CE. Afterwards, the best view moved atop the West Rostra. This new viewing position had a key advantage. Because of the height of the floor of the rostra, 3.75 meters, the new position was only 47 meters from the facade of the temple. Hence, the visibility of the facade and its decorative sculpture was improved, even though the angle of view was now oblique. The Temple of Vespasian's actual frontal view was blocked from the start by the staircase and pronaos of the Temple of Saturn. An alternative second-best view would have been provided by staying on the west rostra and looking at the temple from an oblique angle of 21 degrees. This concentration of temples to deified emperors showed that the Roman Forum represented the most desirable location in the city for such a cult sanctuary, even if the vacant ground available required that the view of the facade be less than ideal. With the passage of time, people must have become used to mounting the west rostra to gain an oblique view. This oblique viewing, perhaps at first felt to be a compromise, became a new principle of the design for the Forum by late antiquity. The Basilica Aemilia and Basilica Julia also have similar oblique views from atop the west rostra. Moving on to the east rostra, let's first turn our attention to the Temple of Julius Caesar. Prior to the construction of the east rostra in the late 3rd century CE, the ideal vantage point for seeing the facade of the temple was 46 meters from the columns of the pronaos, with eyes tilted at 15 degrees. However, once the rostra was built, the viewer could gaze the facade from a higher vantage point, again 3.75 meters above the level of the Forum, reducing the distance for the best frontal view to about 30 meters, albeit with a slightly higher eye tilt. Other structures visible from the east rostra include the Temple of Castor and Pollux and the Arch of Augustus. The Basilica Aemilia and Basilica Julia are also visible, however the views are much worse from the east rostra. Yet the Tetrarchic 7 honorary columns and the column of focus are seen to excellent advantage from the east rostra, which perhaps not coincidentally dates to the same phase of the Forum's development. It should be noted that views of these columns from the west rostra are also good. Thus, the reason why Constantius started on one of the rostra in the Forum should now be clear. It was an efficient and effective way to see the greatest number of monuments in the least amount of time. But which rostra? Assuming that Constantius was taken to just one rostra, we agree with de Junge that Ammianus probably refers to the west rostra and not the east, because more monuments are optimally visible from it, and also because the other two venues mentioned by Ammianus that the emperor visited, the Curia Julia and the Tribunal, are in the immediate area of the west rostra. We can also begin to address why the view from the west rostra would have made even a sophisticated and well-traveled visitor such as the emperor react with amazement. Of course, there are innumerable personal factors that may have been responsible for this reaction, but speaking generally, there are several reasons we may adduce. Research in the field of environmental psychology has shown that the built and natural environment can have strong negative or positive impacts on human beings, affecting their behaviors, beliefs, and emotions. In terms of the content of what Constantius saw and where he was situated in the city, the concept of imageability by Lynch offers some insight. Lynch argues that individuals understand urban environments in components which he refers to as nodes, landmarks, edges, paths, or districts. The ability of a component to cause delight or some other positive emotion is a function of its imageability, or that quality in a physical object which gives it a high probability of evoking strong emotions in any observer. As has been shown, the rostra afforded excellent visibility of principal monuments around the Forum Plaza. For a late antique visitor, the Roman Forum would have been a rare nodal space filled with inscriptions, portrait statues, and monuments marking important events in Roman history with high imageability. We know from Ammianus' description that the moment when Constantius gave voice to his amazement was precisely when he stood on the rostra. The elevated position, with excellent sightlines of principal landmarks, actualized the Forum's potential as a landmark-filled node, concentrating Roman space and time, overwhelming the mind with sights, memories, and associations. So it was not simply the beauty and monumentality of the buildings seen in the Forum, but the concentrated impact of gazing at a scene filled with such a variety of buildings and monuments, rich in historical associations, and the natural upward direction of the view towards the sculpture crowning the columnar screen that all contribute to an environmental psychological explanation of Constantius' response to viewing the Roman Forum from the rostra. To summarize, our 2 case studies of the rostra in the Roman Forum show how CityEngine can support new scholarship by making it possible to re-examine a nearly vanished space such as the Roman Forum. The ability to move around the models at normal eye levels allows us to observe aspects of the Forum that would be impossible without CityEngine. In doing so, we demonstrate how ancient historical records can be brought to life, as we were able to do with Ammianus' account of how Constantius II started his Forum tour by mounting the rostra, a detail which, as far as we know, no previous scholar has tried to explain. Thank you.